In 1961, a 27-year-old psychologist at Yale University placed a newspaper ad in New Haven, Connecticut. It offered $4 for 1 hour of your time, a study on memory and learning. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. The people who answered that ad had no idea they were about to become the most disturbing dataset in the history of psychology. The psychologist's name was Stanley Milgram. He was small, polite, well-dressed, the kind of man you'd trust immediately. The son of Eastern European immigrants, his family had watched from across the ocean as their relatives were loaded onto trains and marched into camps by people who were by every available measure, ordinary. Milgram had one question, not why the Nazis did it. That question had been asked 1,000 times. His question was simpler, more dangerous. Would you do it? Here is what happened to the people who answered the ad. You arrive at Yale's psychology building. A man in a gray lab coat introduces himself as the experimenter. There is another participant in the room, friendly, middle-aged, slightly nervous. You draw slips of paper to decide who will be the teacher and who will be the learner. You get teacher, the other man gets learner. The drawing is rigged, you always get teacher. The learner is taken into an adjacent room and strapped into a chair. Electrodes are attached to his wrist. You are seated in front of a machine with 30 switches, labeled from 15 volts to 450 volts. The labels progress from slight shock to danger severe shock. The last two switches simply say XXX. The experimenter explains, you will read word pairs. The learner must repeat them from memory. Every time he gets one wrong, you flip the next switch. Each shock is 15 volts stronger than the last. It begins easily. The learner makes a mistake. You press 15 volts, then 30, then 45. Nothing happens. Just a click and a buzz. At 75 volts, the learner grunts. At 120, he shouts that the shocks are painful. At 150, he screams. He demands to be released. He says he has a heart condition. You look at the experimenter. The experimenter says, "Please continue." At 180 volts, the learner screams that he can't stand the pain. At 270, an agonized scream. At 300 volts, he refuses to answer any more questions. At 315, silence. Complete silence. From that point on, every question you ask is met with nothing. No answer, no sound, no sign that anyone is alive on the other side of the wall. And the experimenter says calmly, without emotion, treat no response as an incorrect answer. Please continue. Here is the part that made Stanley Milgram famous, the part that he himself did not expect. Before running the experiment, Milgram surveyed 40 psychiatrists at Yale. He described the setup in full detail and asked them to predict the results. How far would people go? At what voltage would the average person refuse? The psychiatrists were unanimous. Most people would stop at 150 volts. The first scream, fewer than 4% would reach 300. Only 1 in 1,000, a genuine sociopath, would go all the way to 450. 65% went all the way, not 1 in 1,000, 2 out of 3. Ordinary people, postal workers, teachers, engineers, salesmen, people who had come to Yale on a Tuesday afternoon for $4. They sat in that chair, heard the screams, watched the silence, and kept pressing buttons. Not because they were monsters. Not because they enjoyed it. Most of them were sweating. They kept going because a man in a gray coat told them to. No gun, no threat, no punishment for refusing. A man in a lab coat. 4 simple phrases. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must continue. 4 sentences. That's all it took. Nobody wanted to believe it. Milgram's colleagues accused him of fraud. The American Psychological Association investigated his methods. Newspapers called the experiment cruel, not for what it did to the learners, who were actors and never received any shocks at all, but for what it revealed about the rest of us. The experiment has been replicated in at least 36 countries across 6 decades: Italy, South Africa, Australia, Jordan. The numbers barely change. The compliance rate holds between 61 and 66%, regardless of culture, language, economic status, or decade. Whether you ran it in 1963 or 2009, the result was the same. 2 out of 3. Every time. But Milgram didn't stop at the famous version. He ran 19 variations, and the variations tell you more than the original ever could. Then the experimenter gave instructions by telephone instead of standing in the room. Obedience dropped to 21%. When two experimenters gave conflicting commands, obedience dropped to 0. Not low, 0. When the participant had to physically place the learner's hand on a shock plate, obedience dropped to 30%. And when another participant, a Confederate, refused first, obedience collapsed to 10%. Read those numbers again, not because they're statistics, because they're a map of the exact conditions under which a normal person will hurt a stranger. Physical proximity to authority, absence of dissent, distance from the victim. Remove any one of those props and the obedience collapses. It was never about personality, it was about architecture. 12 years before Milgram placed his newspaper ad, a psychologist named Solomon Asch at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania ran an experiment so simple it sounds like it shouldn't work. A group of 8 people sit in a room. They are shown 2 cards. One card has a single line. The other has 3 lines of clearly different lengths, one short, one medium, one that obviously matches the first card. The task is kindergarten level. Say which line matches. 7 of the 8 people are actors. They all give the same wrong answer, deliberately, confidently, as if the wrong line is obviously correct. The real participant is always seated second to last. They hear 6 people before them. Intelligent, normal-looking adults all choose a line that is clearly wrong. The difference isn't subtle. It's 1.5 inches. A child could see it. A person with impaired vision could see it. 37% conformed. They said the wrong answer out loud, matching the group, on trials where the correct answer was obvious. Not under pressure, not under threat, not with electrodes or lab coats or screaming, just 6 strangers picking the wrong line. And when Asch interviewed them afterward, the participants didn't say they'd caved to social pressure. Some of them said they genuinely believed the group was right. Their perception had shifted. They didn't resist and lose. They never resisted at all. They looked at the line, heard the group, and saw what the group saw. Their brains had edited reality to match the room. Milgram's experiment showed that people will obey authority even when it costs them something they value, their own sense of decency. Asch's experiment showed something arguably worse. You don't need authority at all. You just need a room where everyone agrees. The architecture of obedience is simple. An authority figure, a graduated commitment. Start small, escalate slowly. Physical distance from the consequences, and most importantly, the absence of someone saying no. The architecture of conformity is even simpler, just people, in a room, agreeing. In the 70 years since Asch and Milgram published, we have built the most sophisticated conformity architecture in human history, and we carry it in our pockets. A comment section where 600 people hold one opinion and you hold another. A feed that shows you what everyone is liking, sharing, buying, believing. A world where the group is no longer 7 strangers in a room, it's 7 million strangers on a screen. And you are always seated second to last. The line is still on the card. It hasn't changed length, but the room got bigger, and the room always wins. Every generation looks back at the last one and says, I would have refused, I would have seen it, I would have been the one to say no. And every generation, when its moment arrives, discovers that it wasn't. Milgram spent the rest of his career trying to understand what he'd found. He died in 1984 at the age of 51, heart attack. He never fully reconciled with what his own experiment had shown him. In his final writings, he said something that sounds like an excuse but reads like a warning. He said, "The problem is not that people are cruel. The problem is that people are obedient. Cruelty requires motivation. Obedience requires only a structure, a lab coat, a chain of command, a room full of people who have already said yes. 2 out of 3 people will shock a stranger because a man in a coat told them to. 1 in 3 will say a line is shorter than it is because 6 strangers said so first, and the distance between those numbers and the ones that produce the worst moments in human history is shorter than anyone wants to admit. The question was never, are there enough cruel people to do terrible things? There always were, and they didn't need to be cruel at all.